Hello, you guys, and welcome to my championship weekend picks and predictions video. A slight disclaimer here: I will be analyzing Jarrett Stidham at least the best to my ability via like stats and when he's played due to the odd occurrence of him playing in what you may not know is his first postseason action of his career. So, without further ado, that's the game we're going to start with, and I'm going to talk about Stidham first. Now, looking at his stats, obviously he didn't play at all last year, as most people know already. But we look back to 2023, which he was under Sean Payton, and the only games he played besides preseason, which I won't be including because obviously that's not a good analysis at all, is week 17 and 18. So looking at this, they played the Chargers in week 17 and they were able to win a 16-9 game where Stidham threw 20 for 32 for 224 yards. This is pretty respectable, although I'll say it was probably pretty conservative. I remember that season with the Broncos, and obviously they weren't going anywhere that year, so they weren't really having anything to play for. But clearly, it was a very conservative play calling with a good amount of completions, but not a lot of yards, and he only had one TD. Now we also look at the amount of attempts rushing because he is a scrambling QB. He had 6 attempts for 6 yards. Nothing crazy there. Then the final week of the season, they played the Raiders, where he was actually sacked 5 times. And I guess, looking at the Chargers, he was sacked 2 times in that game. So not a crazy amount of, I guess, pressure from the Chargers. But then you go, and you're at the Raiders, you're in a hostile environment, which I get that this game is at home for the Broncos. But he got sacked 5 times, losing 34 total yards on those. And he only ran 3 times for 2 yards. So even worse, and had a fumble as well. And this is on top of having also a pick. So he had one TD, one passing TD to 2 turnovers or potential turnovers where the fumble, they didn't lose it, but that goes to show he did have more yards in this game, but he had 2 more attempts with the same amount of completions. So maybe a little bit more risk, but they did lose this game 14-27. So eerily close in the amount of, attempts and completions. And, obviously had a couple more, potential turnovers, but that was it. Now, I guess, looking back, even further, obviously in 2021 he was on the Raiders, and he didn't play at all actually. It's kind of wild. He did not play at all. And this was the year the Raiders made the postseason. In 2021. In 2020, we go and we look, and regular season, he had w- what looks like to be, a lot of fill ins. And this was when he was on the Patriots. So he had, even in the limited amount of times he played there, in week 4, he literally played at the Chiefs where they lost 10-26, and he only had 13 attempts, but he threw for 2 picks. Now I get that this is looking way back down the pipeline, and then I guess we can go and we can look at 2019. But overall, this is a guy who obviously hasn't thrown for a lot of yards in a single NFL game. Like I said, I'm not including preseason, but he has not played since obviously December of 2023. And obviously looking at this, like the guy, even then he took a few sacks. The Raiders, I can imagine that, Max Crosby had a day. The Chargers, I mean, it must have been Khalil Mack, or somebody else on that team getting sacks. But to me, Stidham is kind of one of these guys that it's like, sure, he's had production, but he hasn't had any postseason play at all, which I just think, adds a new dynamic, and especially when it's the championship game. So that's kind of my thoughts on Stidham. I do think that that he can run around. I think the protection is good. Obviously, if we're looking at the stats here, let me pull this up. Obviously, Bo is not playing, but we will analyze that he was only sacked 22 times this year. And then Cortland Sutton was sacked on what I can guess was kind of a trick play that just didn't end up working out. I think I may have remembered this game where they actually, I can't remember who it was against, but they covered the receivers and Sutton took a sack for whatever reason. But, you know, all in all, they gave up 22 sacks to Bo, which he was a harder guy to bring down. And I think that Stidham is a bit more mobile. So that is where I will give credit to Stidham, but hasn't played in, a little over 2 years. The other thing I'll mention is that Dobbins is out for this game. They were practicing him, but they ruled him out, so he will not be back. So it'll still be up to RJ Harvey. And then you do have guys. Let me look at the Denver Broncos. You do have Troy Franklin, who is questionable, and then you have Pat Bryant, who is also playing. They are likely to be at full strength with their wide receiver room, and obviously, the guy that Stidham is probably the most familiar with on this team is Cortland Sutton, as he has been on this team. And you look at guys like Franklin and Bryant, and they haven't had had as big of a role until this year. So we do also look at the defense. The defense is pretty much healthy. You have Patrick Surtain playing. I know people were wondering whether he was going to play, and then everyone else is healthy in terms of starters. So they are going to have the really good defense. And I think that the Patriots need to worry about the pass rush, obviously. That's what we've talked about with the Broncos defense. But I do think that with, Diggs and Booty on the opposite side, and then even Kyle Williams seemingly emerging, having, a really good, presence on offense where he has, his fair bit of opportunity with catches. I think that Drake May's been distributing the ball all around, which I think will definitely very much help them against this Denver defense. And I think that Diggs is one of the more sly route runners and one of the more quick-witted guys. So even though I think Sertan has the upper hand, I do expect Diggs to be a back and forth battle regarding that, depending on if they have him shadow Diggs, which I don't think. Even Demario Douglas, to me, their fourth wide receiver, has been doing, good things for them. And not to mention, Hunter Henry's a solid tight end. So a good amount of guys playing, and Ramondre Stevenson has been running very well, and Travion Henderson is a good complement. So I think, I obviously give advantage to the Patriots in this game because they have a guy who's been playing well. And I think that it's been kind of a rough go for Drake May, but he's been playing some defenses that aren't letting anything up for free. And you could argue that he's going up against, potentially the Texans with the number one defense, and he's going up against 1A to 1B, potentially with the Broncos, where they're both top tier defenses, top five in the league. And I haven't really talked about too much about the defense of the Patriots, but let's go to that. Harold Landry is out for this game, unfortunately. I do think Clavion Chason has been doing a very, very good job lately of getting pressure and playing with very, very good energy. And overall, I think that you look at this kind of DB room, and Carlton Davis with a good pick last week. He is questionable, but I'm pretty sure he's going to play. And then you talk about Christian Gonzalez and Marcus Jones. I think that I would say advantage DBs against just about every single wide receiver for the Broncos, maybe besides Cortland Sutton, who just seemingly, even if he is covered, he's a very good contested catch wide receiver. So obviously looking at, this, there are seemingly three guys that they have with wide receiving touchdowns are RJ Harvey, who's good at catching and going on ball, Franklin, and then Sutton. But oh, excuse me. But obviously, I think that you look at this New England defense, and I think that Melvin Williams and Christian Barmore are going to make it very hard to run for RJ Harvey. And I just see a lot of good things, coming up and coming from this Patriots defense where they have started to rise to the occasion. I think they kind of played a more calmer defense in the regular season, but now that it's postseason, they are kind of amping up, their intensity. So, with that being said, I am going with New England, which I know many people are probably like, "Oh, Denver does have a shot in this game." I just wonder if there's going to be a little bit of, rust or too much pressure on Stidham. And sometimes you're in a loud stadium like your own, and if it isn't calm, the nerves can really start to get to you, I can imagine, especially as a starting QB. And while there is a good amount of people that believe in Stidham here in Denver, which is good, and that the coach, obviously is going to say the right things. The only other reassuring thing, I guess, is that Stidham has been in this system the last 3 years since Sean Payton came on. So he knows the system, and hopefully his arm can be, calm under wraps and he can make some completions. But I am going with the Patriots in this game. And with that, we will move on to the Rams versus Seattle. So obviously this game quite crazy. If we look at the Seahawks, obviously the last time these guys played, they went for two in overtime, and they were able to complete it to, a tight end right over the middle that people, it wasn't guarded essentially. And it is one criticism that I've had for the Rams is that seemingly a team that never seems to put value on their linebacker position, more than anything else on their defense. I personally think that it's, over the middle. That's just something that Seattle's going to be able to use, and they're going to be able to, exploit from the Rams defense. I think that that's kind of the nail biter thing in the Rams defense. I do think that this secondary is better than what people have said. I've always said that they're very scrappy and opportunistic, which obviously last week they were against the Bears and Caleb Williams. And then obviously a game that, they definitely gave up their fair bit of big plays to, let the Bears stay in it. But Seattle, I mean, not much needs to be said other than them just completely smoking and tearing off the tires against the Niners, which I think, you look at them having a bye. To me, they looked like a true number one seed. The Broncos last week, even in a day where Jared Allen didn't look very good, like they didn't look very good. I didn't really talk in hindsight about that, but I do think that this game it plays a lot bigger of a role. And the Rams, you play a game like that where you're on the field and you're giving up long drives. I do think that they're going to be a little bit fatigued for this game. And that Seattle, despite this being, the championship game and they obviously played last week, they seemingly just, won that game with a breeze, and that's a lot more uplifting than a gritty, grindy game where your quarterback didn't play up to the standard that we thought he would. And you go and you look at Seattle, who it's like they don't have the wear and tear of just an intense game of like, man, we really could have lost this game. But I guess let's look at the players and kind of the matchup for this game. So looking at the Rams first, you obviously don't have like any injuries on this team. They are about as healthy as you could be on offense, with the only guy missing is Havenstein, who's been on a IR. So I don't really think that's even that big of a blow. On defense, they only have a few guys on IR and one questionable. Byron Williams questionable. I don't think it's going to be a problem. If I'm being honest with you, Byron Young's a heck of a player, opposite Jared Verse, obviously, but you don't have anybody really missing from this team. that may be a Keller Witherspoon, but this secondary has played, I think, better than what people give it credit for. And they obviously have caused headaches for Sam Darnold. Now, you look at the Rams, and they didn't really have that much success against the run in the Bears last week. The Bears seemingly kept on rushing it, they kept on getting a good amount of yards. And I would argue that I think Kenneth Walker is more talented than Swift and Monangai, and he's obviously going to be the workhorse. Looking at the Seahawks, they obviously do not have Charbonnet, which I think is, somewhat of a big blow, but I do think Kenneth Walker to me is a guy who can rise to the occasion, much like a Jameer Gibbs, not as explosive, but can be kind of a workhorse back because he's speedy, but he's got that stockier build slightly like Gibbs, where the guy can take a hit and he can deliver some punishment. Now, Rashid Shaheed, JSN, Cooper Cup, I think are, set to have, kind of a big day. I think JSN has had kind of a quiet end of the season. I think that, maybe they weren't trying to get him as involved in more to make sure he was well rested and that sort of thing. But it has opened up for Sam Darnold to throw it to these other guys on the team and get them more involved. So I kind of expect this game to come to which third wide receiver can kind of have a great game. And I believe, I guess, more in Shaheed, even if I don't know, I would maybe consider him the second wide receiver option on this team. And you look at the Rams, obviously Puka and then Adams. It's kind of interesting to me, but I think that they're going to have some trouble with this Seattle defense where, you're talking about Emin Wari lining up against Devontae Adams, which I will say I think the more physical corners, albeit this guy's a safety playing nickel, can do a very, very, very good job in physicality with Adams and give him a rough time. Same with, Witherspoon lining up against Puka Nakua. I think Devin Witherspoon is just a heck of a tackler, sticky coverage, and really good at getting up on the ball. But the safety room as well, like this is, going to be a lot of dink and dunk. But these guys are guys that, come down quickly downhill and will help a lot. But looking at this game to decide who I think is going to win, I just think that, Stafford has, been sacked 23 times. Darnold's been sacked 27 times. It's kind of one of those unique scenarios to me where, it's the rubber match of these two teams this year being in the same division. And perhaps with it being a hostile stadium, I'm leaning to go to the Seahawks. And I just think that the Rams, while they have the veteran QB to do it, I just think that the Seahawks are hungry. They played with more energy and more push around last week than the Rams. And the Rams, while they played in kind of a hostile environment type of thing, they've just been too off and on to me. And the Seahawks seemingly, even when they shoot themselves in the foot a lot, and I'm talking about the first matchup where Darnold had 4 picks, they still put up a lot of points because this is a very talented offense. And I think that they've finally started to put away the woes they had of an offense that would stumble on themselves. They would just not play well. The blocking on the O-line wasn't good, and they've seemingly rectified a lot of things. And the O-line is in probably the best place it's been in a long time in Seattle, which has helped a lot. So I'm going with Seattle in this game, and may the best team win. But tell me what you guys think, down in the comments, or who you have winning or why. I definitely think these games could still be very, very close. And it still is kind of a what if kind of thing with how weird the NFL season has been. Who knows? Maybe Stidham comes and has the best game of his career, proving that maybe this guy should be looked at for a starting job in the NFL. But it seems kind of asinine to me. But, this season, seemingly nothing has kind of been a sure thing, I guess. Besides these teams with injuries that have just, slowly fallen apart, like the Niners, the Packers. But seemingly we have a lot of, healthy teams in the championship game, which, doesn't shock me. But, feel free to, comment what you think's going to happen or how the games are going to play out. And as always, go Pack Go.